All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. And today I want to share some ideas on the difference between competition and collaboration. And it's it is an idea that has been working with me and working on me for quite some time in a observing human nature as human nature exists today, as it manifests itself today. And yesterday I picked up a book that was on my bookshelf for a very long time. I don't even know where I got it. I think somebody gave it to me as a gift, or I picked it up in a secondhand bookstore. But it just seems more like somebody handed it to me one time and said, "Here, this is a good book. You ought to read this." And the title is A God Within, and the author is Rene Dubos. And Rene Dubos was a microbiologist, a scientist by training, and he also became a humanist philosopher. And it's very interesting. I can't wait to finish reading the entire book. But when I read the first few chapters, he was talking about kind of the difference between this idea that life is a struggle, a contest to win. We have to work hard, we have to fight hard, we have to play hard, as opposed to the cooperation and the collaboration that we find in nature. And he kind of spelled out in the first few pages some things that have been a thread through things that I've been reading and studying for years. He even went back and said, if you look at the founding of America, and you look at the two schools of philosophy as represented by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, which were the mercantile class, and then you look at Jefferson's philosophy, the populace, which was the collaborative working class. He said it was there. It was there at that time. And I started thinking, wow. And I go back even further, because I can go all the way back to the ancient times and what we consider primitive religions, which in some respects I think folks at that time may have been closer to the realization of spirit than we give them credit for. You know, we look at the cave drawings and we try to interpret them through modern eyes, and they may not mean at all what the modern scholars tell us. They may have been a closer feeling, a closer connection to all of life that people felt at the time that they were trying to express through their drawings, through their shamans, through the icons of spirit animals and things like this. May have just simply been a way of people expressing their essence that they felt of their connectedness to everything, that everything was alive, everything came from the one creator. See? We've kind of lost that. We've kind of lost it as we go through the modern era. But even back in the very ancient times, even back in, for us in our culture, we go back, the Old Testament is pretty much as far back as we go. And yet there were religious philosophies certainly that preceded that. But even at that time, we had two schools, we had two camps. We had one camp that had male deities, and these were warlike gods, and they were the gods that were worshipped by the hunter-gatherers. And these gods were very much like us. Very, it's interesting how we say that God created us in its image and likeness, but if you look back at it, it appears that humans have created God in their image and likeness. Because that God had enemies. And coincidentally, it just happened that God's enemies were the enemies of the people who worshipped it. And it was okay to go and kill the enemies and steal their goods and burn their crops and carry off their women and children, because they were God's enemies and God gave them permission to do that. And this idea of struggle, you see, with the hunter-gatherers as they wandered around, the nomads, and they came upon each other and they came upon cities, the idea that everything there was for them to plunder. It was theirs by right. They could take it. and they could take it because their God said they could take it. Because those people, well, they're just not like us. They're different. We don't feel kindred to them. And then the other big theme that runs through religion, and you'll see this as I draw it out. You'll see this bringing itself right up to modern day, right up to the headlines in today's news. And the other way of life, the other philosophy of looking at life was, no, see, life is not a struggle. Life is not a competition. Life is a collaboration. Life is a harmony. Life is a balance. We need each other. We need the synergy. We depend upon each other. We are all individual parts of the same whole. And we're not as much different as we are alike. And by cooperating and collaborating and working together, we can produce something better together than we could individually. And this is kind of the struggle. If you look through the ages, this is kind of the struggle. And of course, the people who believe in war and fighting and violence and all those things find very easy pickings in the pacifists and the people who believe in harmony and peace, and they tend to subdue them. They tend to conquer them and put them down. But even though they conquer these people, they cannot extinguish the flame, the essence of this idea that we are truly one, that we are truly harmonious. They try to put down these ideas and kind of, if you remember the commercials maybe 20 years ago, there was a commercial, I don't even know what it was for, but the tagline was, "It's not nice to fool Mother Nature." And there was this lady who played Mother Nature. And that was mocking the religions of harmony, the goddess religions of peace, the goddess religions of harmony. Right? This idea that nature is all of our mother, that we are all its children, that we all exist on this planet Earth together, and what we do to one, we do to everyone. You can see it if you remember any of the history of the what we call the American West, but what happened as the Europeans moved west across this continent and kind of pushed the native peoples off of their land. There's a famous speech that is attributed to Chief Seattle, which we don't really know if he gave it or if the newspaper man writing it gave it and attributed it to him, because the chief didn't speak English, so we don't know how it came. But it talks about this concept of owning the land, and the sky and the water, and that these things belong to our children. You hear it in the philosophy that we don't own the land, we're renting it from our children. What we do to the land, we do to our children. A totally different view of life than the one that says everything is here for our use and for our taking. So these two views kind of continue to duke it out, if you will. They kind of continue to push back and forth against one another, and you can even see it in the headlines. If you read through the headlines of what's going on in the political races in our country, the one side kind of looks like it's espousing the competitive view of winning and all of these things, and the other side is talking about things like taking care of one another. So we see this all playing out even before our eyes today. But more importantly, it is playing out in our own lives, in our own consciousness. And we want to focus on that. We want to focus on what's going on within us, because we can't go out there and point the finger at anybody else and say, well, you all doing it wrong, you need to change. We need to go within, and we need to find our own position and live from that position. And then those who see us and choose to be affected by us will want to know what's going on. So it's not, I'm not talking about social activism today. I'm talking about each and every one of us as people who are responsible for our own lives and our own choices, understanding the struggle that goes on between the ideas of competition versus collaboration, and understanding where we come down, which side we come down on, and why, and perhaps what the benefits of that may be. So DeBow tells us, he says, you know, in science, we try to take things and we analyze them and we take them apart and we want to categorize them, we want to put them into buckets and isolate them from the whole system. We want to try to isolate them from the whole system. And he says you can't really do that. You can't take something away from its system and look at it in isolation and understand it. You have to look at the whole picture. And on the other hand, we really can't understand the whole picture without specific examples. You know? So the two go hand in hand, the microcosm and the macrocosm. And of course, Dr. Holmes tells us that you and I, you know, we are the microcosm and God is the macrocosm. That we are in the individual what the divine is in the whole. Or as Fenwick Holmes might say, we are in the relative what God is in the absolute. So DeVos says if you look at things and you try to analyze them, the differences between them cannot usually be accounted for, or at least the examples he gave, cannot be accounted for by the things that we weigh and that we measure and that we touch. So he gave the example, you know, if you look at planet Earth, for example, not that remarkable in terms of the galaxy, in terms of the universe. You know, it's a speck of dust, one of the smallest things floating around in space. It's one of 8 or 9 planets in our solar system, depending on whether you count Pluto right now and the other planets that you're finding. But there are other planets in our solar system. You know, you can measure planet Earth. It's you know, they know how much it weighs. They know what the diameter is. They know all of these things about it. But yet there's something different about it. See, there's something very different about it. And if you just look at what it weighs and how big it is and how far away from the sun it is and all those things, you don't get to appreciate the uniqueness of it. But it's teeming with life. It is absolutely teeming with life. And it's not just human life. It's teeming with life. Every part of this planet is teeming with life. If you look at human beings and if you look at chimpanzees, for example, you'll see the reports on the news, you know, that we have about 99% of our genomes, or DNA. We share with the chimpanzees. Does that 1% difference completely explain the uniqueness of the humans when compared to the chimpanzees? And what Dubot is expressing is it probably doesn't. See, there's more to it than can be weighed and measured and touched and felt. And if we, instead of just trying to analyze things and say, well, this is 99% of that, if we could really kind of dig into the uniqueness, into the newness, and into the difference of things, then we might start to appreciate the essence of life, the essence of what is there, what it is that is essentially trying to make them different. So he talks about this essence. We're going to come back to these ideas, but he talks about this essence, and we want to get this first. He says, wherever you go, there's something unique about it. There's something different. There's each culture that you go to, there's something special and something wonderful about it. And no matter who invades, what army invades, who tries to take over, how things merge, all of this, the cultures tend to remain in some regard as they were. Right? Everything changes, but nothing changes. Right? The daily life goes on as it was. And it's uniquely different than each and every other place. And he gives examples. You know, if you go and sit down here in the United States, if you go and you sit down in a coffee shop and have a cup of coffee, It's a totally different experience than if you go to a cafe in Italy and sit down to have coffee. Or perhaps a cafe in Austria or Germany or England. Each experience that you have where you will go is uniquely different according to that culture, according to the essence of what that is. And what he's telling us is the essence doesn't change much over time. The circumstances around it may change, but the essence doesn't change. If you look at your pictures when you were a small child and you look at pictures that were taken, let's say, at 10-year intervals up until now, you can still look at that and you can still say, well, yeah, I see the resemblance. I see the essence that was in there. In terms of what meditation would teach us is we would say the observer hasn't changed. That we are the observer who is observing the child and observing the teen and observing the young adult. And the circumstances change, the body changed, the geographical location changed, but the essence of who and what we are hasn't changed. So what Dubot is telling us is that there is this essence of all of life, that each part of life has its own essence, and it doesn't change much. It continues on in its own unique way. It continues expressing itself, even though the circumstances around it change. It continues on. We read stories about how 3 billion years ago a giant object from space collided with the Earth and extinguished almost all of life. Almost all of life on Earth was extinguished. But what was extinguished? Life was not extinguished. See, life continued on. And the essence of life, the thriving of life, the livingness of life, if you want to call it that, continued. I remember reading one time, someone asked Dr. Holmes after the invention of the nuclear weapons, they said, aren't you concerned that human beings might completely blow up the planet and destroy all of life, including themselves? And Dr. Holmes says, well, that could happen. He says, certainly people could do that. He says, but what would that change? He said, life would continue on. Life would go someplace else. It would take a different form and it would continue on because it's its very nature, is its very essence to live. So if we look at nature and if we look at just the essence of life, we see collaboration, we see cooperation. The soil is teeming with microbes. If you could get the weight of all of the microbes in the soil, they would weigh more than all of the other life forms on Earth. That's the quantity that is out there. And each has its own unique purpose, and each has its own way of living. And they each cooperate. You know, if you go for a walk in the woods, if you've ever been out, it's not often that we come across the remains of an animal. You know, one of the things they talk about with if you ever watch the shows about Sasquatch, you know, they say, how come we never found the body of a Sasquatch? Well, how many times have you ever seen the body of a bear or a deer? You know, I've seen one site where I found the bones of a deer and parts of hide of a deer, and I don't think they were there that awfully long. And the reason for that is there is life in the soil that when something falls, whether it be a leaf or a bird or a bear or a deer, when something falls in the woods, immediately the microbes in the soil know what to do. Immediately the life knows what to do. In fact, when very small animals die in the forest, there's a type of beetle, I think they call it a funeral beetle or something close to that, and they actually carry the corpse away. And they take it someplace and they bury it. They dig holes and they bury it, and then they lay their eggs so that when the eggs hatch, the eggs will use the nutrition from the decaying body to grow. So life knows how to take these things that fall, and it knows how to immediately convert them into a new and different life form. Everything's being recycled. You know, everything knows what to do. They reintroduced the wolves to Yellowstone, you know, and human beings had hunted the wolves to extinction there. They had completely driven them away, as we do with our idea of competition. If you don't like something, you get rid of it. You know, You win, you defeat it. Now they brought the wolves back into Yellowstone, and they find that the bison are thriving. Even though the wolves live off the bison are thriving. Because the wolves have a role to play in collaboration, in cooperation. The wolves and the bison need each other. Because the wolves take the sick out of the herd, the old and the tired and the sick. And it makes the herd stronger, and the stronger herd reproduces more. And the wolves get stronger. And even though they seem to be in competition, you would think, well, the wolves are killing these animals and eating them. There's a collaboration going on. And they don't hunt each other to extinction, see? They don't just completely trying to do away with them. The fact that we have to have Yellowstone Park as a sanctuary for the bison because, hundreds of years ago, people just shot and killed them from the trains, cut out their tongues as a delicacy, skinned them for their hides, and were denying the Native Americans of the source of food that they needed to live. That was done out of a sense of competition. But collaboration is the essence of life. It is the essence of the way life on Earth works. One part of life inhales carbon dioxide and exhales oxygen, and another part of life just the opposite. And the two are essentially the same. The two are parts of life in this divine dance, in this divine cooperation. We don't recognize that when we look at ourselves in isolation. We don't stop and think about what we're putting into the air and what it's doing to not only our lungs, but everyone's lungs. And this idea of cooperation, collaboration, it helps us to kind of be more aware of that. Now, what has happened is that as human consciousness has evolved, it has really latched on to this idea of competition as being the best thing for us. You'll hear people say, competition brings out the best. Well, does it really? Does it really bring out the best? Now, maybe competition can provide the motivation to get people to do more than they would do without it, people who need that sort of motivation. But does it really bring out the best, or is it limited? Maybe it brings out better, but not the best. And I say that because there are some things in today's world, there are some things that require collaboration in order to resolve. When I was coaching execs in business, we had reached a point in the life of our business where individuals had risen to the top of the individual business units within the corporation. We had presidents of like 8 different business units, and they had gotten to the top by being tough competitors, right? They got to the top because they wanted to win. They wanted to be number one. They wanted to be up there. And we reached a point in the life cycle of our business where now we required them to collaborate with one another. We had to get them all to work together to a different vision rather than their vision being their self-serving one, their competitive one of winning and getting to the top. Now they had to work together for the good of the organization, for the good of the corporation. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't have the skills to do it. They wanted their unit to be okay and let everybody else fend for themselves. And as much as we tried to tell them, if the entire ship goes down, your business unit is going with it, they wouldn't believe that. And what they were doing is they were preparing themselves for their next career because they wanted to be able to go to their next employer and say, hey, my business unit was okay. It was everybody else that wasn't pulling their oar. And if they put me in charge, why, the ship never would have sank. So this idea of competition bringing out the best is not always true. I mean, the significant problems that we are looking at in the world today require collaboration, not competition to fix. And if we have created a society that believes that competition is the best way to do things, we'll never get to solve those problems. And again, look at what's going on in world politics and look at what can't get done because people can't find a way to collaborate and work together and to resolve them. So this idea that we can isolate ourselves from the world in which we live, that we can separate ourselves from our very nature, the essence of what we are, which is a part of this life, and that we can somehow prevail and bring out the best by competition is an idea that we really have to look at in our own lives and say, do we do that to ourselves? Do we fight against our own nature? Do we put down the essence of what we are? And in doing so, are we not only denying our own soul, but denying ourselves the fullness of our expression? See, in this idea of competition, it carries with it the implication that everything is a resource to be used, and the value of anything is what use it has to me. Right? Well, what good does that have for me? What can I do with that? If we don't understand what the value of something is in terms of what we can do with it, if we can't see how we can make money off of it or use it for whatever we believe, right? One of the things in competition, the idea is that if everybody's working for their own self-good, their own self-interest, that's going to create the best for everybody. And what happens is if people don't see the value in something, they don't see their connection to something, they don't see the value in something, it means nothing to them. It is something to be ignored. If they do see the value in something, then it's something to be accumulated and something to be used. And when you're done using it, it's something to be thrown away. You know, look at what's going on in Appalachia now. You know, I remember years ago when they started these big mining operations, and people were concerned about the environment. Everybody said, "Don't worry, you know, they'll put aside funds to make sure that that's taken care of if they ever go out of business." Well, now they're going out of business and they're saying they don't have the funds to clean it up. So it didn't serve this idea of everybody works in their own self-interest. We can find examples of where it doesn't work. It gets to a point where it collapses, and then somebody else has to come in and bear the expense of cleaning up after the mountaintops have been removed and all those sorts of things. And I'm not against business. I'm not against people making a living. I'm not against anything like that. I'm just saying that sometimes we need to collaborate. Sometimes we need to think about our impact on the bigger system, our impact on each other. And competition has its limits, and competition does not bring us to the best. It may bring us to better, but it does not bring us to the best, because the significant problems that we face require collaboration. So these are the kind of ideas that we wrestle with, and then we got to come back and say, but what about us? What about ourselves? What about us as individuals? We can look at the examples in the business world of where it didn't work, but what about ourselves? And this is where I really think that DeBose really touched it. Whenever we are working in a manner that denies the essence of who and what we are separating ourselves from our soul. We are separating ourselves, as he would say, from the God within. We have lost something. We have sacrificed something. You know, we may gain, in the Bible, New Testament tells us this, what good is it if we gain the whole world and we lose our soul? What good is it if we have to deny our humanity, if we have to deny our spirituality, if we have to isolate ourselves from the very life that we are part of in order to make more money, in order to gain success in our business or our chosen tasks. We've given up something. I put this anecdote in the email last night because it just seems so appropriate. But in 1969, the Globe, which was a UK newspaper, sponsored a sailing race. It was an around-the-world, single-handed, non-stop race. Now, these sailors came together. Their boats were maybe 40 to 50 feet long. Sailboats, because they couldn't stop for fuel. And they were allowed to leave England within a certain window of departure, a certain number of days they had to leave. And what they were going to do was they were going to sail completely around the globe and come back to the starting place. And when the last sailboat came in, they couldn't stop. And when the last sailboat came in, they were going to calculate when they left, when they got back, and whoever had the shortest time won. And one of the competitors was a Frenchman named Bernard Moitessier. And remember, this is 69, so hippies were still kind of in vogue. And I see Moitessier as kind of having that little bit of hippie blood in him. And he entered the race. And he left England and they sailed down, he sailed down the Atlantic and turned past Africa and went all the way across the Pacific and came back out South America and turned up, and he started to head back up towards England. And he was maybe 3/4 of the way up the coast of South America. And he had an epiphany. He said, "What am I doing? I'm sailing for money." And he perceived that to be immoral. Sailing for money. He says, sailing is not for money. Sailing is for the experience. Sailing is for the experience of the sea, to discover our oneness with the sea, to be alive in the sea. To do it for money, he says, that's immoral. I can't do this. So he altered his course and he headed back for Cape Town, Africa again. And remember, he hasn't stopped yet. And he went past Cape Town, Africa, and he was sailing somewhere along there, and a freighter spotted his ship, which the sailboats that were in the race had unique markings on them, so that as they passed different merchant marine ships, the merchant marine ships could radio their position into the race headquarters. And the people who were running the race, they didn't know that he decided to abandon the race. They thought he was lost somewhere. So this freighter, and they put out an advisory to the vessels to please be on the lookout for Moitessier. And this freighter spotted his sailboat, and they came up alongside of him, and they shouted down through the megaphone. They said, "Are you Moitessier?" And he shook his head, yes. And they said, "Wait a minute." And ran up to the bridge, and they ran down, and they threw down something that had a piece of paper tied to it. And Moitessier opened it up, and it was a compass heading, and it said, "Sail this heading to return to the race." And Moitessier wrote a note on the other side, put it back on the bolt, and he had a slingshot he used, and he used a slingshot, and he fired his message back up. And his message said, "If I should sail that course, I would lose my soul. If I should sail that course, I would lose my soul." He knew that he had to go back to the essence. He knew that he had to go back and find his collaboration, his cooperation, and his harmony with life. And he knew that you can't compete your way to harmony. To him, it was more important that he find his soul. So he continued on. He sailed all the way back to Tahiti, and he settled in Tahiti for several years. It was a nonstop voyage of, I think, almost 40,000 miles. Nobody's done anything like it since. And I think that is the essence of the message of that, what we're talking about today. Because what Du Bois tells us is that all of the great thinkers, Einstein included, tell us that their best ideas came not through logic and reason, but through the essence of what they are. through imagination. Remember, Einstein discovered relativity by wondering what it would be like if he could sit on a beam of light as it came out of a flashlight and he could move with that beam of light at the speed of light. What would it be like? There is so much knowledge and wisdom in the essence of what we are that we lose touch with when we deny our soul. That if we could get back in touch with that, we would find that we have more wisdom and more power and more peace than we ever knew existed. The word enthusiasm, in olden times people used the word enthusiasm. They discovered enthusiasm, and to us, we kind of think of it as meaning excited. They got really excited about something. But enthusiasm meant from God, from the Spirit, that they were receiving divine ideas, inspiration, right? Imagination. And that something was coming through them that was better than they could come up with on their own. So what we want to consider is that just as the essence of a culture can interact with other cultures, can interact with other circumstances, with other conditions, but the essence comes through. The flavor of the cooking of one culture comes through almost no matter what dish you ask the chef to make. You'll be able to taste that culture in there. There's something there. There's an essence to it. And the essence of what we are, at the physical level, the essence of what we are is part of life. But at the spiritual level, the essence of what we are is part of everything. Part of everything. And we don't want to lose our soul. We don't want to ignore the powers of the soul, the imagination, the inspiration, the intuition. We want to cooperate and collaborate for the highest good of all. We want to be able to allow Spirit to express itself through us to a degree that far exceeds anything that our intellect and our ego and our competitive nature could ever possibly do on its own. So if we come to the realization then that our society, the society in which we currently live, is very firmly of the opinion that competition is the way, but we recognize that collaboration, cooperation, harmony, and unity are the very essence of what we are and the very essence of what God is. What does God have to compete with? What does God have to win? You can even see in our religions that we have made religion a game, a competition to be won. We must struggle through life in order to save our immortal souls from the God who gave them to us and then would take them away from us. And we've got to ask ourselves, what? How could that be? God has nothing to struggle against. God has no need to win, to compete. God is one with everything. So I hope that we come to accept that our true nature is not competition, but one of collaboration, one of cooperation, one of harmony. And yes, the world that we live in will not understand that. We have to be in the world, but not of the world. But we have to be willing, as Motissier was, to abandon the race and to turn and set sail in a direction that first prevents us from losing our soul, and second enables us to rediscover that which was always there, which was always within us, which was always waiting for us to acknowledge its presence, and to give the gifts to the world and through us that it can give only as us. It's time to stop thinking that we are only human. It's time to stop thinking that God made us to struggle and to fight and to claw our way through this life by the sweat of our brow and by the virtue of our tenacity. But to recognize that life created us out of itself because it needed us to express its life. And to surrender ourselves to its activity. In previous times, as I say, people were more in touch with the anima, with the animation, animating, they called it, of all things. The trees were alive, the animals were alive with spirit. They acknowledged the spirit in everything. And Dubois gives us an example of how artisans worked in those days. He gives an example of an Aboriginal person who lived up in the Arctic. And they carved little figures out of walrus tusks, the walrus that they hunted for their subsistence. And these people were one with everything. Remember, they felt their oneness with everything. They felt their unity with all of life. The mythologies of the Aboriginal peoples tell us this, They were one with the food that they ate was a gift from the gods. They were one with all of life. And the person who was going to carve something out of a piece of ivory would hold that piece of ivory in their hand, and they would roll it around and they would look at it. And they would say, "What are you? What's in there? What is it that's trying to come out?" Until they saw the image that was imprisoned in that ivory. And then they carved away the rest so that what they had left was the seal that was hidden in there, or whatever it was that they were carving. And you've heard the story. You've heard the story of the sculptors who said, you take the block of stone and you just carve away everything that's not the angel. The craftsmen worked with the wood, they worked with the stone, they worked with the ivory until they found what was in there, and they let it speak to them, as opposed to our way of doing things in the competitive society where Lori and I were on a cruise some years ago, and we went to a cameo shop in Sorrento, Italy, and they had rows and rows of craftsmen, and they had some little material that they were working with, and they had their tools, and they were carving out all these little cameos, and each one looked exactly like the other. So here they were taking the material, and they were trying to force the material to take the form that they wanted, because that was the form, of course, that the tourists would pay for. And think of the difference of the craftsman who picks up the piece of ivory and says, "What are you? What are you trying to tell me?" They're collaborating with that ivory. They're cooperating with that ivory. They're acknowledging the unity of life through their art. They're expressing their oneness. So each and every one of us is that valuable piece of ivory. But we haven't seen the uniqueness that is in there. We haven't seen and recognized the goodness that is in there. We haven't found the gift that is in there because we have been trying to make it into something that the world wants to buy. We have been trying to force ourselves to be that which our parents told us we needed to be, which our teachers told us we needed to be, which the little charts that tell us who makes the most money in the newspapers tell us we ought to be. And we are trying to force ourselves to be something that we are not. We are moving away from the essence of what we are. We are losing touch with our soul. So I invite you then this week, take these ideas and mull them over. Find some other books to read. Find some other things to study. Ask yourself, where in your own life, where have you been denying your soul? Where have you been turning your back on your essence? Where have you been trying to make yourself into something that the world wants instead of picking yourself up and looking at yourself in the mirror like the native would look at the ivory and say, well, what are you? What's in there? What are you trying to tell me? What is it that wants to come out? You see, each and every one of us is a beautiful creation of the divine. Each and every one of us is an integral part of this life. Each and every one of us is extremely important, or we wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be here if God didn't need you to be here. But we have been left alone to make that discovery, and we have been allowed to become confused in the process. And we have been allowed to go off into belief that competition is the way, and that having the most stuff is what's important. And now we must come to our point of epiphany as Motissier did. And we must recognize that the moral thing to do is to set the course that'll find our soul. I invite you this week, spend your time, find your soul, let the enthusiasm, the inspiration of God, the divine ideas, the intuition, let it flow through you and as you, and lead you to wherever it is that you need to be on this earth at this time. Get in touch with harmony. Get in touch with collaboration. Get in touch with all of nature. And recognize that you are not separate from it or different than it or apart. That you are it and it is you. And you have returned. You have returned to your soul. And so it is.